It's a pleasure to see you all here. And it's a special pleasure for me to see so many very distinguished scholars here in Farmington Hills to participate in this wonderful colloquium. It is my especially great pleasure to introduce Professor Carol Meyers, who will begin the colloquium. Professor Meyers has a brilliant and distinguished career. We could spend at least an hour going over her credentials, and we would all frankly profit from it. Very briefly, Professor Meyers is a professor in the Department of Religion at Duke University, and also for many years has taught at the University of North Carolina. There at Duke, she conducts a summer program in Israel, and she is also at present the Associate Director of the Women's Studies program at Duke. Professor Meyers is a distinguished and very well-published archaeologist, but archaeology is only the tip of the iceberg of her many accomplishments. She is an accomplished scholar in all of biblical studies. And her topic today is going to be the origins of ancient Israel. Let me just begin it with saying this. One of my favorite playwrights, the father of the modern sitcom, is a Greek writer named Menander. And one of Menander's best lines is, "We all have a father, and we think we know who our father is. That is, we really don't. None of us really knows." The nature of Greek comedy, almost every Greek comedy, is the revelation that your father is not who you thought he is. Your mother is not. Furthermore, you yourself may not be who you think you are. We Jews all think we are the children of Abraham. We all think that we are the children of Moses, who founded our religion and our culture. We pride ourselves in that beautiful land across the sea. That land was taken by our great conqueror, Joshua. But Professor Meyers is going to, I'm sure, bring you into the world of modern-day biblical scholarship, the world of newer realities, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce her to you.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out on this dreary morning. It occurred to me only while you were speaking before that when I began my academic career a couple decades ago, the very first talk that I gave away from my own campus, which was also the last time that I was in the state of Michigan, was at the University of Michigan, somewhere in the mid to late 70s. I can't even remember the year, so it's very nice to be back here again after all that time. Not long ago, in an issue of the Israeli news magazine, Jerusalem Report, which I hope many of you know, it's kind of the Israeli Newsweek, that magazine featured a cover story with the provocative title, "Did the Exodus Really Happen?" At about the same time, an independent film company in Virginia, New Dimension Pictures, produced a 22-minute video aired on the Learning Channel as part of its archaeology series called "Who Were the Israelites?" A new board game called Exodus has recently appeared in toy stores. Meant for ages 10 and up, it affords the 2 to 6 players the exciting opportunity to follow the Israelite journey from Egypt to the so-called Promised Land. Several years ago, on a fall weekend just like this one, well, maybe not quite so rainy, At a public symposium in Washington, D.C., at the Smithsonian Institution, there was a lecture and a discussion on the Exodus from Egypt, myth or reality, ? DreamWorks, you know what DreamWorks is? Okay, the new film company created by Spielberg with Jeffrey Katzenstein and David Geffen is currently hard at work on a feature-length animated film to be the longest film ever, such film ever, 7 minutes longer than The Lion King. And it will be called The Prince of Egypt, and it will be the story of Moses and the Exodus. Wow, these 5 productions, and there probably are others that I don't know about, span the media types: print, lecture, television, big screen, as well as board game. And they are all concerned with Israelite beginnings. The tantalizing question of how and when ancient Israel emerged is clearly part of popular inquiry. It is no longer the intellectual property of scholars and theologians. Now, note that the title of at least 3 of those cultural productions I mentioned are interrogatives. Did the Exodus really happen? Who were the Israelites? The Exodus, myth or reality? These questions, I think, indicate that long-held notions about Israelite beginnings are not the sacred truths, literally meaning that sacred truths they once were. Rather, they're the subject of great debate, and I can't think of any subject in biblical studies that is more hotly debated right now than this very question of Israelite beginnings. These questions indicate, as all the titles do, that the focus of this inquiry into Israelite beginnings is on the period of the Exodus from Egypt and the beginnings of community life in the land, not on the period that preceded that, not the period of the ancient Hebrews, of the ancestors. Although the world of popular culture has clearly seized upon the importance as well as the mystery of Israelite beginnings in the age of Moses and his successor Joshua, I'm not sure that the religious education of children or adults in our synagogues is attuned to this interest, let alone with the debate that swirls around it. I can't tell you how often my Jewish students come up to me after class in the introductory Bible course that I teach at Duke. They come up to me and they say rather wistfully, "How come I never learned this in Sunday school?" What I'd like to do is help fill in that gap in Jewish education. I'd like to share with you what some of the problems are and what some of the possible solutions are. Let me first point out, in case you haven't already got the message, that when I'm speaking of Israelite origins, I don't mean the ancestors. When Rabbi Wein first asked me to participate in this colloquium, he asked me to discuss my views of Jewish beginnings in a talk that he had titled The Origins of the Jewish People. As you've probably noticed, that's not the title that's in your program. I told him that I was not comfortable using the term Jewish to refer to our biblical ancestors, the ancestors from the time of the period of Judges and the monarchy through the early Second Temple period. That is, and I know it's hard to remember dates, but I'm going to ask you to at least try to keep a couple in mind, from about 1200 BCE, and that will be a critical date, until the 4th century. This is really the period of the Israelites. That is, the distinctive features of Israelite culture, which include beliefs and ritual practices, are sufficiently distinct, different from those of Judaism, that calling the Israelites Jews is, in my opinion, a blatant and misleading anachronism. The Israelites were antecedents of the Jews, but they were not Jews in any traditional sense. They certainly did not hold the ideas about Torah, about God, and about worship, among other things, that characterized emergent Judaism in the last centuries BCE and early centuries CE. The productions of popular culture that I mentioned above all focus on the biblical account of the Exodus event and the ensuing settlement in the land of Canaan as the proper place to consider Israelite beginnings, and I agree with that. The ancestors, formerly known as the patriarchs, but now we're inclusive, the ancestors, Sarah and Abraham, Rebecca and Isaac, Rachel and Leah, and Jacob. They do not appear in this quest for Israelite beginnings, which may come as a surprise to people like me, who have been traditionally taught that Abraham was the father of the Jewish people. The overwhelming consensus of contemporary biblical scholarship, except for that practiced in the most conservative circles, is that the ancestors, the matriarchs and patriarchs, are at best faintly legendary figures. The narratives in the book of Genesis describing them have been skillfully created to provide eponymous antecedents for the groups called the people of Israel in the biblical account that emerged in the highlands of Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age, around 1200 BCE. That is the late second millennium BCE. The ancestor tales in Genesis are the fascinating and largely fictive stories of individuals and their households. The details of the stories perhaps bear authentic traces of some early second millennium BCE Levantine life, but the values and beliefs embedded in the words and deeds of the matriarchs and patriarchs are largely products of a later age. Okay, so what about Israelite beginnings? What about Israel as a community, not just individual families, a group of people, a people transcending the small family groupings portrayed in the ancestor stories of Genesis? When can we talk about an entity called Israel, and how can we reconstruct its emergence on the ancient Near Eastern landscape? Let me say that I'm glad Steve pointed out that this colloquium would involve a lot of questions and maybe not many answers. All those questions about ancient Israelite beginnings are ones for which there are no definitive answers. A generation or so, that might not have been the case. The major body of evidence for the history of Israel, that is the Hebrew Bible, was taken as a reliable source for historical reality, for the events that actually happen in real time outside the textual accounts. It is not surprising, perhaps, that the Bible has been read as an historically reliable document for centuries, from the rabbinic period onward. What is surprising is that viewing the biblical story as authentic history continued even in the advent of critical biblical studies from the Enlightenment on. Well, maybe that's not so surprising either when you think about who was doing the biblical scholarship. Until quite recently, biblical scholarship, critical biblical scholarship, and by critical biblical scholarship, I don't mean scholarship that has a negative or criticizing attitude, but rather scholarship that evaluates texts using philological and comparative methodologies. In any case, critical biblical scholarship, until very recently, existed almost always in theological contexts, in theological seminaries and divinity schools. And those contexts tended to privilege assumptions of biblical historicity. To be sure, critical scholarship did conclude that the opening chapters of the Bible in Genesis were truth-bearing myths. Yet the books of Exodus and Numbers, Joshua and Judges, Samuel and Kings all look so much like history writing that they arouse little suspicion about their historical reliability. These biblical books about Israelite beginnings read like history and were treated as historical records, albeit ones with literary embellishments. In the present academic world, which goes far beyond divinity schools and seminaries, includes University of Michigan, Duke University, the security of the Bible as a reliable witness to Israelite beginnings has been virtually demolished, or at least strongly contested, for good reasons. Well, for several good reasons, actually. And I will deal with some of them, which include archaeological materials today. Archaeology, let me begin there, has held an enormous impact on our understanding of the biblical account of Israelite beginnings. That account begins, as you know, with the dramatic Exodus story, in which a group of laborers are miraculously released with the help of human leaders, Miriam, Moses, and Aaron, from Egyptian exploitation and oppression. This is not a feminist speech. I'm sorry about that. They made their way through the Sinai wilderness, all 600,000 or actually closer to 2.5 million of them, where they, right, where they experienced an unprecedented national theophany. You know, God appeared to all of them at Mount Sinai, and they then coalesced into a people with a formal constitution called the Covenant and a specific destiny to inhabit a land promised to their ancestors. Then there's more. Avoiding or defeating hostile peoples along the way, they swing around to the east of the Jordan River and swoop into the promised land just east of Jericho. They violently destroy the people of Jericho, including the women and the children, and even all the domestic animals. A similar fate befalls the city of Ai, according to the book of Joshua, just north of Jerusalem. And then all the rest of the land falls to Joshua and his warriors, despite the resistance of the indigenous inhabitants. Joshua 11 sums it up. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had promised to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. Now, one might want to be skeptical about such an account if for no other reason than that the perpetration of violence against so many innocent people seems like a quintessentially ungodly act. Yet the biblical justification for all that violence against innocent people, that is, that the land was originally promised to Israelite ancestors and that the inhabitants faced by Joshua were really sinners whose iniquity made their annihilation inevitable, that seems to be rarely questioned. But there are other reasons to question this account. It has long been noticed, for example, that the Bible itself contains other narratives besides this master narrative in Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua that contradict the conquest tale. Now, what is this contradictory material? Many of the episodes in the book of Judges indicate that the tribal acquisition of the whole land of all Israel was hardly swift and hardly complete, as the book of Joshua would have it. According to the Judges narrative, the Canaanites and other peoples continued to live in their strategically located city-states along the coast and in the major valleys, and they persisted in attacking and menacing the newcomers. The stories in the book of Judges cannot really be harmonized with the account of the sweeping Joshua campaign. Yet those contradictions did not, for some strange reasons, did not really pose a serious threat to the accepted authority of the Joshua narrative, and critical scholarship of the last 2 centuries in seminaries and theological contexts attempted to reconcile these divergent pictures of conquest in various ways. In general, the Judges' account was seen as somewhat more realistic, somewhat less legendary, but ultimately it led to the same result: an Israelite military conquest of the land through violence. Critical biblical scholarship in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, up till quite recently, accepted the biblical version of Israelite beginnings. Finally, the historicity of this narrative was called into question by the very kind of research that at first was thought to be an instrument of verifying Scripture, archaeology. At the outset of the mid-19th century, at its outset, archaeology's outset, at the mid-19th century, and for much of the subsequent programs of fieldwork, archaeology in the lands of the Bible, so-called biblical archaeology, had as its central and absorbing interest the understanding and the exposition of Scripture. That's not quite the same as proving the Bible, and archaeologists in academic circles were quite careful to distinguish aims to recover the biblical context and background from attempts to verify the biblical word. Yet, in the popular mind, aided and abetted by such apologetic bestsellers as Werner Keller's The Bible as History, Archaeology Confirms the Book of Books, and by a limited number of conservative scholars, biblical archaeology aroused seemingly inexhaustible fascination because of its lurking potential to validate the Bible. More sophisticated members of the general audience, for the many popular books and TV specials on biblical archaeology, people like you, I'm sure, have realized all along that even the validation of biblical events as having taken place could not verify the underlying biblical claim, namely that God was the one who caused those events. Yet the fascination with archaeology and biblical events continues. But what if those events never took place? It's one thing to say that verifying biblical events doesn't prove that God caused them. It's another thing to consider the biblical account as fictive in many cases, or in many places. What does that do to the place of the Bible in our tradition? The flip side of archaeology now comes to the fore. For archaeology may sometimes validate Bible facts, but sometimes it challenges their veracity altogether. Let's think again about this triumphant account of Joshua's conquest of the seemingly impregnable city of Jericho. The archaeological interest in the land of the Bible has typically zeroed in on many of the cities at which prominent events of the Bible are said to have taken place. The conquest of Jericho is clearly one of them. Already in the first decade of the 20th century, a German team began excavating there, but the first major project came in the 1930s when the British archaeologist John Garstang traced the city's history back well into the Stone Age. It's one of the oldest cities on Earth. In so doing, he found an extraordinarily thick, well, almost 2 feet deep, destruction layer. And he interpreted that as a great conflagration that he identified as the visible remains of the assault of Joshua and all the Israelites on the site. He was finding evidence that the story about Joshua and the walls coming tumbling down was true. But a generation later, in the 1950s, another British excavator, Dame Kathleen Kenyon, renewed the work at Jericho, and her work still stands as a model of methodological excellence. Her conclusion about that thick destruction layer was that it was centuries older than the earlier excavators had claimed. In other words, Jericho was virtually uninhabited at the time that the Israelite invasion was supposed to have taken place. The biblical Jericho tradition is in direct conflict with the archaeologically retrieved record. The American excavations at the site of Ai, which was the second major Joshua story about conquest, also said to have been utterly destroyed by Joshua and all Israel in Joshua 8, that excavations there produced similar results. The city, whose very name means the ruin, had in fact lain in ruins for nearly a millennium by the time the Israelites were said to have overrun the central hill country, demolishing cities, exterminating populations. This evidence for the unreliability of the biblical account of the early history of Israel has been complicated by other archaeological discoveries. Excavators had discovered that a number of the Canaanite cities claimed by the Joshua narratives to have been destroyed by the Israelite invasion were actually destroyed violently at the end of the Late Bronze Age. So at first it looks good. This is about the time the Israelites were supposed to have done all this destruction. Lachish in the south, Chatzor way in the north, Bethel in the center of the country are such sites. Yet, how do you know, just because they've been destroyed, that they were destroyed by Israelites? It just so happens that we have other ways of seeing that the late 13th century was a time of great unrest in this part of the world. Archaeology can readily demonstrate that a city was destroyed, but it cannot demonstrate the city of those who perpetrated the destruction. How can we be so sure they were Israelites? Now, all this unrest in the eastern Mediterranean in the 13th century BCE was because at that particular time the superpowers of the ancient world, Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, were somewhat weaker, and they were losing control of the land of Canaan, which they normally did control. And there was a lot of unrest. The political instability led to inner-city warfare, no doubt. And some of the conflagrations, some of the destructions, perhaps at Bethel and Chatzor and Lachish, may have been caused by inner-city warfare, not by some invader from the outside. And also, there are other possible causes of burn layers, destruction layers in archaeological ruins. Sometimes there are just accidental fires. Sometimes fires were set deliberately to control plagues that happened to have been rampant in the ancient Near East at that time. And in addition, we know that another group of people called the Philistines were probably arriving in the land of Canaan at this time, and they themselves may have attacked some of the old Canaanite city-states. The archaeological evidence for urban destruction, which has led to a kind of crisis of credibility in considering the biblical record of Israelite beginnings, is accompanied by yet one other kind of excavated data which challenges the historical reliability of the biblical account even more. The material culture of the early Iron Age settlements, the 12th and 11th century, the ones usually associated with the Israelites, is in many ways a continuation of Canaanite culture. Many of the artifacts of the new settlements, the so-called Israelite settlements, are the same as the ones at Canaanite sites of the same time, and are descendants of Canaanite forms and models. This calls into question the very notion that the Israelites were a discrete group, a separate group of settlers coming in from the outside en masse. It also leads to the provocative question, to which I'll return later, of cultural or ethnic identity. How would you know an Israelite in the 13th or 12th century if you saw one? And would they have called themselves that? Now, in addition to all this archaeologically induced skepticism, there is another kind of skepticism that involves in thinking about the Exodus itself. And as the titles of some of those popular cultural productions I mentioned at the beginning indicated, that we are asking, was there really an Exodus? Again, archaeological materials, or now rather the lack of them, are significant. Archaeologists for generations have been searching for evidence in Sinai and in the Sinai Peninsula and in Egypt that would authenticate the biblical account of the Exodus. But no Egyptian inscriptions refer to either the enslavement or the escape. No archaeological remains found along any of the possible routes, and none of the identifying the routes is problematic, alluded to in the biblical tale, date to the period at which the Exodus in the 13th century is supposed to have happened. For example, the ruins at the major Sinai oasis, really the only major oasis in the whole Sinai Peninsula, is at Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are said to have been camped for a considerable length of time, have been excavated repeatedly, going back to a 3-day dig in 1914 by none other than Lawrence of Arabia. The earliest of the extensive series of fortresses there date to the 10th century BCE, several centuries after the postulated Exodus date. And even the identity of Mount Sinai has never really been satisfactorily established. There's a leading candidate, Jebel Musa, Mount Moses, but there are a dozen other possible sites. None of those sites have archaeological remains that would remotely connect them with what the biblical narrative is telling us. Clearly, archaeology has created a crisis in the study of Israelite beginnings. But that's not the only crisis. There's a crisis from historiography. No sources outside the Bible mention Moses or Joshua. No documents from other ancient Near Eastern peoples refer to the devastation of Pharaoh's armies or of the Canaanite city-states at the end of the Late Bronze Age. The archaeological evidence for an Israelite invasion and conquest is negative or ambiguous at best. That means that the biblical text is the sole witness to those central events of early Israel. But how reliable a text is it? What kind of literature is really contained in the biblical account? Is it really history writing, which is what Jewish and Christian tradition has always taken it to be? Is it a compendium of facts about early Israel that the historians could draw upon, as indeed they have, to construct as reliable a picture as possible of the emergence and development of ancient Israel? These questions point to the fact that new developments in the historical disciplines have created fundamental doubts about the way we do history and what our sources are, especially in the last 2 centuries. actually, history as a self-conscious discipline, thinking about its own methodologies, is relatively new, or at least the models that it uses are, until recently, are relatively new. They arose in Enlightenment Germany as the culmination of Renaissance humanism in the 18th and 19th centuries, and they involve very positivist attitudes about ideas such as truth and objectivity. But in the last few decades, there's been a growing awareness that the way people used to do history may not work very well. There's a much more awareness of the fact that people who do history, write history, reconstruct history, are usually influenced by their own worlds in ways that they don't even recognize. And also, there has always been a kind of naive assumption that the kind of sources that we might have available to us in the modern world for doing history are not all that different from the kind of sources that we have for doing ancient history, when in fact that may not be the case at all. The most extreme critics of the project of writing history say that you can't do it at all, that the ancient texts that we have are so removed from the reality that they propose to represent that it's a hopeless task. Now, I'm not in that camp, but I think it's a lot more difficult and complicated a project than earlier generations would have thought. Historians today are still at it. They're far more sensitive, though, first to the way in which the times in which we live influence our views of the past, and also to evaluating more critically the kinds of sources that we're using. Let me first talk about this notion of historians' bias. Until very recently, and I've already alluded to this, modern writers of Israelite history have not really been trained as historians. That is because they've been people from seminaries and divinity schools. Their own education has not been in the methodologies of history writing. Furthermore, they have had a stake in the authenticity of the general scriptural record, even if they admit that some of the details are fanciful. Their views of the Bible as an authoritative document, in other words, tend to privilege the words of the Bible in ways that they would never have privileged the words of other ancient writings. Even non-fundamentalist liberal scholars, both Jews and Christians, who were ready to discount the Garden of Eden story or the Noah story as myth and the ancestor narratives as quasi-fictive legend, inevitably succumbed, beginning with the so-called national history of Israel at the time of Exodus and conquest, to simply retelling the biblical stories, leaving out what they may have recognized as being folkloristic embellishments, and adding a few skeptical comments where archaeology seems to cause problems, as I've indicated. But mainly the renditions of ancient Israelite history produced in the quasi-academic world of seminaries and divinity schools until recently presented the story of Israelite beginnings as the way it was, but rather what they were simply doing was retelling the biblical stories. Theoretical concerns about the nature of the biblical sources were virtually non-existent. There were other kinds of biases besides these theological biases that said that this was God's word and therefore it must have happened that way. Many Israeli scholars and also eschatological Christians and both Christian and Jewish Zionists have had a stake in showing that the ancestors of the Jews possessed the land at a very early date. One of the most influential Israeli archaeologists, for example, the late Yigal Yadin, you may know him because of his excavations at Masada more than anywhere else, but he excavated at Chatzor, and he stated unequivocally in one of his popular publications on it that in the 13th century, Jabin, king of Chatzor, was defeated by Joshua and the tribes of Israel. All right, he completely accepted the Joshua account, and he used the excavations at Chatzor to so prove that. As critical biographical work on Yadin now shows, all his energetic and his massive archaeological projects in Israel, such as Chatzor, Masada, and the Bar Kokhba caves, involves errors of interpretation and sometimes even deliberate distortions of the findings, all to serve nationalistic purposes. Now, some of the radical skepticism today about the validity of biblical materials about ancient Israelite territorial acquisition is in many ways a backlash to that kind of archaeology and biblical studies. It's a backlash on the part of biblical scholars today who are less sympathetic to Zionism, or at least more sympathetic to Palestinian rights. And they're sensitive to the way in which biblical claims to territory have been used as precedent for contemporary nationalist claims. Attempts to understand early Israel's emergence, it's now clear, has to be sensitive to these religious and political implications. Now, the second issue that this new historiographic self-consciousness arises is the nature of the sources, the reliability of the biblical texts, which have already, their reliability is clearly already called into question by the archaeological data I've just been talking about. It seems likely that the biblical narratives of Exodus, conquest, and settlement are not authoritative history at all, not authenticative history at all, but rather they're a mixture of fictional imagination and historical memory brought together at a later period. Don't forget, or maybe you don't know, that these narratives I've been talking about all reach their final form centuries and centuries after the events that they purport to relate. And they were brought together centuries later for ideological purposes. Maybe it's useful to think about some of Shakespeare's plays in this context. You might wonder why. But no one would doubt that there was a man named Julius Caesar, right? But no one would use the play by that name as a source for what the first Roman emperor said or did. The play Julius Caesar has been constructed by one of the world's most skilled playwrights, who probably used at least some ancient sources or Elizabethan historiographies in creating his masterpiece. Perhaps we should think about the stories of Moses and Joshua and the judges in much the same way, as masterfully crafted narratives, preserving memories of a formative period and constructing along with them compelling dramas about the lives and deeds of the personae dramatis in ways that have blurred forever the boundaries between historical event and literary embellishment. What may well have been historical characters and events are available to us now, Moses, Joshua, the others, only in brilliantly constructed stories. The historical reality of Israelite beginnings has, in a sense, been made unhistorical by the artistry of the storytellers, who, pre-modern folk that they were, had no concept of writing history, of distinguishing fact from fancy, in short, of producing text, the kind of text we in the 20th century would like to have. And unfortunately, as I said before, there are no extra biblical written sources about this formative period of biblical history. Now, you may wonder, in light of all I've said, if the task of understanding when and how Israel began is impossible. No, it's not. Despite all this skepticism, there are attempts to discover Israelite realities, and they're more vigorous than ever. While the most radical skeptics would say, don't use the Bible at all, only use archaeology, I think that's too drastic a step. And virtually no one has taken that route. Although the biblical books and the chapters setting forth the story of how early Israel emerged are hardly historical writings as such, they are also not fully fictive. They can be and are used carefully and judiciously, along with archaeological and other non-biblical data, to try to reconstruct Israelite origins for the period we're talking about now, or for any period. Instead of taking the biblical accounts at face value, we must analyze them, and we must reconstruct in ways that really involve probabilities, not proof, guesses, not certainty. We must accept the fact that we can never be really sure about what really happened. If we have difficulty being sure about what really happened yesterday or last year, you should hear my husband and I try to figure out what happened last week on somewhere we were both present. We have very different versions of it. So if we have difficulty with that, even when we have videotapes and newspaper reports,
That makes me up.
eyewitness accounts, how much greater is our difficulty in establishing what happened 3 millennia ago? Yet I strongly believe that we should make the effort. Recovering earliest Israel in the light of all these realizations recently that earlier attempts have been flawed has barely begun. And what I want to do now for the time left to me is to talk about 4 different kinds of evidence, and there are many others, but I've picked out 4 kinds of evidence which will help us get a more realistic or see more realistic possibilities than the master narrative of the Bible for understanding events in the late 13th and early 12th century BCE. The first of these is settlement patterns in the highlands of Palestine where the Israelites emerged. Then I'll talk about what kind of settlements they were. Then I will mention a set of biblical texts that I think are important, not the master narrative. And then the last piece of evidence will be an Egyptian inscription. All right, settlement patterns. By settlement patterns, I mean the configuration or type of settlements and their distribution across the landscape. What kind of settlements existed in the land of Canaan in the early Iron Age, 1200 to 1000 BCE, the time of early Israel, and where were those settlements located? But first we have to ask, what was the settlement pattern before the period of Israelite beginnings? The period before the Israelite beginnings is the Bronze Age, and for virtually all of the Bronze Age, for nearly 2 millennia of settled life in Palestine, and even before, the occupied areas of the land, and I've already mentioned this, tended to be the coastal plain, the flat areas, the Jezreel Valley, and several of the larger valleys in the Central Highlands, but not much more than that. The highlands themselves, the hill country of Judea and Samaria, Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee, they were always very sparsely settled, and for good reason. Who would want to live there? The rocky forested hillsides made, yes, they were forested in antiquity, made cultivation of the soil very difficult, and as did the fact that there were very few perennial water sources in the hill country. In the millennia before 1200 BCE, while the seacoast and valleys saw intensive urbanization, the development of international trade, the highlands themselves remained remote and virtually unpopulated. Extensive surveys of this area carried out in Galilee, the West Bank, the northern Negev have shown that this sparsity of settlement changed dramatically at the beginning of the Iron Age. The new pattern is striking. Nearly all the old Bronze Age cities, really city-states, the centers of feudal-like areas of agricultural production providing for a dominant city, all those city-states, or not all, but many of those city-states were abandoned, and an enormous number of new villages, as many as 300 of them, were established de novo in the hill country. The beginning of the Iron Age clearly saw a dramatic growth in the number and the density of highland settlements. I think it's not too dramatic a statement to say that an entirely new settlement pattern emerges, different from any one that had previously existed. Now, what about these new settlement patterns? Questions about them arise. First, how were such settlements able to survive in that rocky, waterless hill country? I mean, there was good reason that no one had lived there before. The answer is that the settlers of these villages were, in a sense, pioneers, and they found technological solutions. They cleared and terraced the hillsides to provide more arable land. They dug cisterns under their villages to store water that was collected during the rainy season to last them for the dry summer months. Who were those settlers? Maybe they were the Israelites, but I'll come back to that. In any case, I've already said that the material culture of these settlements is in substantial, not absolute, but substantial continuity with that of the material culture of the Canaanites. The basic cropping patterns, the pottery, is heir to those features of the Canaanite city-states. Archaeologists who've excavated some of these villages have claimed that although the settlements themselves are new, the inhabitants of the settlements do not appear to be newcomers to the general area. A powerful hypothesis has emerged, which I support, It sees the settlers as not newcomers, but rather refugees or escapees from the Canaanite city-states, from the tyranny and the exploitation of the feudal Canaanite cities. These were people who couldn't take it anymore, and they fled to the uncharted, vacant territory in the Highlands to build settlements of their own, where they could work their own land and enjoy the products of their labor. Were these settlers called Israelites by others? Did they call themselves by that name? Did they yet differentiate themselves from the Canaanites? Interesting questions. More data are needed before answers to such questions can be offered, but at the very end, I'll give some idea about what I think about those questions. Now, the second thing, the nature of these settlements. What were these settlements like? The new Highland settlements of the Iron Age were dramatically different from those of the Canaanite city-states. They are villages, first of all, not cities. And they are tiny. Some are as small as half an acre, what would be a nice-sized suburban lot, although here I think an acre might be more like it. Others are 2.5 acres, about the size of 2 adjacent soccer fields. The larger villages are less than 2 hectares, which is about 5 acres. The inhabitants of such sites rarely numbered more than several hundred individuals. And the really small villages, hamlets really, maybe 50 individuals would have inhabited them. The small size of the villages is not their only striking feature. Noteworthy also is the relative uniformity and size of the contents of the individual dwellings. And this apparently indicates relative economic equality. There's no socioeconomic differentiation, at least according to the archaeological remains. No single family unit has amassed a disproportionate amount of resources. Another important feature is that there is a virtual lack of specialized buildings or facilities, structures that could be identified with having administrative, political, economic, or cultic religious functions. And there are no walls around these cities. There's no military, in other words, probably. No defense systems. The excavated remains of these early Iron Age villages clearly suggest a relatively egalitarian society, economically and politically. These data contribute well to the hypothesis mentioned above, that the inhabitants of these villages were concerned with retaining their own family property, working it themselves, and keeping what they produced, not paying taxes to the Canaanite overlords. Can any biblical data be used to support such a theory? Now I'm going to look at the third kind of evidence, and this is from the Bible itself, but it's not the narratives of Exodus and conquest. It's some legal documents. The Pentateuch, the Chumash, first 5 books of Moses, contain a number of discrete sets of legal materials, some of which can be dated with relative certainty. The laws in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, chapters 12 to 26, almost certainly took shape sometime after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, late in the 8th century BCE. Another set of laws, much more relevant to this discussion, is a much shorter collection in Exodus 21 to 23, a section that's usually called either the Covenant Code or the Book of the Covenant. And it's related to the covenant because it follows immediately the biblical account of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments at Sinai and facilitating this covenant agreement between God and all Israel. The legal materials of these 3 chapters are mostly in the form of case or casuistic law, and they have been subjected to intensive study and to cross-cultural comparison. There can be little doubt that they come from a society with no king and no standing army. The civil and criminal cases dominate, but there are also some specifically moral and ritual concerns. Allusions in these laws to the economic base of society, the social level of its members, administrative structures, religious practices, all these allusions point to a period before the monarchy. In other words, precisely this period, 1200 to 1000 BCE, which is usually identified as the beginnings of Israel. The Book of the Covenant has undoubtedly been edited to supply explanations and motivations for various precepts, but this brief legal corpus presupposes agricultural village life before the onset of a monarchy. There's no cities in sight in this set of legal materials, no monarchy either. There is one mention of political leadership. There's a reference in chapter 22, verse 27, to a nasi, which is probably a term designating a tribal chieftain. The way of life reflected in the laws is rural and simple, and there's no mention of commerce, artisans, or specialists, which would be associated with larger urban dwellings, settlements. Now, case laws such as this don't set forth a philosophy of justice, but we can still discern in the Book of the Covenant basic principles of liability, of respect for property, along with a strong concern for disenfranchised individuals and those lacking the wherewithal for their own economic survival. These are precisely the issues that would fit the small, precarious social world of isolated Highland villages. In short, these laws seem to be the customary regulations of a village people concerned with protecting the integrity of their property and their livelihood. These laws may in fact be authentic regulations providing social stability for the Highland settlers of the early Iron Age. Now, can those settlers be named? That brings us to the final piece of evidence, an Egyptian inscription. About a century ago, just about exactly a century ago, Sir Flinders Petrie, the brilliant English Egyptologist and archaeologist, who's often called the founder of modern Near Eastern archaeology, was excavating at Thebes in Upper Egypt. There he discovered a black granite slab, nearly 10 feet tall, and he dated it to the reign of a certain pharaoh, the pharaoh Merneptah. Inscribed on it are a series of celebratory hymns recounting Merneptah's triumph over the Libyans in the spring of his 5th regnal year, which most scholars now would date to 1207 BCE. At the very end of the inscription, there is mention of his victory over some other peoples, some Asiatics. Let me just read those last few lines. Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam, which is a town in northern Canaan, was made non-existent. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is not. All lands together, they are pacified. The reference to Israel there is a stunning piece of evidence. For one thing, it is the only mention of Israel in an Egyptian text. Also, the word for Israel is the only proper name in this inscription. You know, there are these other proper names, Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer. It's the only one of those proper names, place names, that is written with the hieroglyphic sign indicating, well, not place names. For Israel, it's written with a sign representing people rather than place. It's referring to Israel as a people, not as a territory. And also the use of the term seed in connection with Israel indicates that the name Israel is connected with an entity that has an agricultural or agrarian economy. Israel in this inscription is exactly the sort of collective designation that would fit residents of tiny Highland villages as described above. The Merneptah Stela, which is sometimes called the Israel Stela, you can figure out who gave it that name, is highly important in the debate about Israelite origins. Now, there are a few scholars who are skeptical about the validity of this inscription as evidence for Israel's existence, but most of us do herald it as a solid indication that the pharaoh Merneptah, who was the most powerful ruler in the ancient Near Eastern world at the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, he was aware of some people called Israel, and he took them seriously enough to brag on this monument of having annihilated them. That he actually wiped them out is unlikely. Pharaohs tended to exaggerate in their commemorative inscriptions. That he had encountered them in his attempt, ultimately unsuccessful, to maintain Egyptian control over the trade routes of the East Mediterranean is highly probable. Now, the term Israelite in that inscription is apparently used as a designation for peoples located somewhere in the land later called the Land of Israel at precisely the time when the biblical text indicates that Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, emerge as the occupants of that land. Just what sort of term is Israel? What sort of people might it describe? Can it be called an ethnic identifier? As you might imagine, scholars are having a field day with that problem. What does ethnic mean? That's a lively topic of interest for all kinds of reasons in the academy today. And there are all kinds of theories or possibilities laid out in the literature about what ethnicity it is. It's very hard to sort them all out. Now, let me just give you some of the features that people look for in trying to define ethnicity. For some, it's a word that's used for a group that is biologically self-perpetuating, or a group that shares cultural values, including language, a group that uses a common set of material cultural forms, a group that interacts with each other within itself, largely, a group that has an inherited tradition or history that helps perpetuate its sense of identity, a group that sees itself as different from groups around it. Now, it's clearly impossible to correlate any, or certainly not all, of these points with the meager materials we have about the settlers in the Highlands. But my sense is that it took the formation of a distinct political entity, the monarchy of the 10th century BCE and later, to impose any or all of these characteristics of commonality upon the people that lived within territorial boundaries. At that point, the traditions, when the monarchy gets formed and political boundaries seem to become more fixed, the traditions of some of the people within those boundaries, the beliefs of some of those people, the values of some of those people, and probably the people that were close to the Judean and Benjamite clans from which the first kings, Saul and David, came, those values and beliefs and history were appropriated as a national culture, a culture that would unify the various groups occupying the fixed territorial boundaries of the newly formed nation-state. That is, the earliest Israelites, or proto-Israelites, I guess we should really call them, the ones, apparently the people who lived in the Highlands, were the entity that gave the name to the larger nation-state that ultimately emerged. Now, briefly in conclusion, I'd like to try to reconstruct from all the data that I've put forth for you what my view of the emergence of early Israel or proto-Israel would have been like. Because of the turmoil, political turmoil, economic crisis in the late Bronze Age Canaanite city-states, scattered groups of exploited peasant farmers and their families that had lived under city-state control had enough and left. They left to set up their own settlements in the hill country. But they were not the only ones. They were probably joined by a small group or groups of distantly related Canaanites who had a long time ago left Canaan and migrated to Egypt. And now we can factor the Exodus account into the scenario, which I virtually ignored for most of this talk. But I don't think that that account should be excluded. The Exodus accounts in the Bible are central and powerful components of the biblical story. And indeed, there is evidence in Egypt that there were Canaanite immigrants from the land of Canaan to Egypt in the Bronze Age. And they would have been there to be able to leave, just not in the numbers and in the way that the Bible describes it. That there is no archaeological evidence in Sinai for the movement of a small contingent of these escaping Canaanites, and not the inflated numbers of Exodus 12, is not really a problem. The absence of evidence for them may not be at all the evidence of absence. The arrival of disaffected refugees from Egypt, handfuls of them, coincided roughly, as I see it, with the withdrawal of related Canaanite peasant groups from city-state control. Perhaps the recent arrivals from Egypt sought old family connections or clan connections, and together these groups founded the new hill country villages, where their roughly egalitarian material culture, although a development of Canaanite ways, ultimately departed from Canaanite ways. The values of the villagers, perhaps reflected in the ancient statutes of the Book of the Covenant, became supported by a myth of freedom. The experience of the few who fled from Egypt ultimately became appropriated by the many as a compelling representation of the ideas of freedom and self-determination, just as in America, the stories of the few, the pilgrims who celebrated the Thanksgiving in the 17th century, the soldiers who fought the British in the 18th century, those stories have become the history of all of us, the expression of our national identity and values. Perhaps some of those villagers in the Iron Age highlands, at least the ones encountered by Merneptah, were called Israelites, probably because they were a group that claimed descent from some common ancestor named Israel, formerly Jacob. Ultimately, they could no longer consider themselves Canaanites because the Canaanites became the enemy, and you had to distance yourselves from the enemy. The narratives of the pre-monarchic period, included in the narratives is an ancient poem, the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, which may very well date back to this period and certainly recounts military animosity between the new settlers and the Canaanite kings. The Canaanites are made out to be the enemy. Whether the Song of Deborah depicts a real battle or not, it does serve to characterize the Canaanites as the other, the enemy, which is certainly a step in separating Canaanites from Israelites ethnically speaking, creating a new ethnic identity. The values of those proto-Israelites can be seen in the absence of hierarchies in their settlements and in their concern for the economic integrity and justice in their customary law. What about their religious beliefs? I've avoided that, haven't I? That's another complicated problem, and I don't want to overshadow the kinds of things I've been talking about by dwelling very long on that. But there is some evidence that they would have worshipped a god, one god among maybe other gods as well, named Yahweh or Adonai, as the name is traditionally pronounced. And the traditions about that god may have originated in Sinai and been brought to the land of Canaan with the Sinai immigrants. That deity was introduced to the Highland villagers and identified with some of the ancient Canaanite gods of the land. Yahweh, Adonai, became a theological symbol for an emerging social reality. But it probably wasn't until many centuries later that Adonai was recognized by all Israelites as the only God. Still, it's difficult to accept an ethnic identity for Israel with all its cultural and ideological manifestations before the 10th century and the establishment of the monarchy, as I've already indicated. Just as the United States of America, a country, begins with state formation in 1776, but at the same time embodies the values of the different and earlier colonial settlers who are called Americans as a totality only in retrospect, so ancient Israel as a people begins with state formation in the 10th century, but embodies the values and beliefs of the proto-Israelites, some of whom, but not all, were undoubtedly known by the name Israel, who first settled in the hill country in the late 13th to early 11th centuries BCE. Their legacy to us is a story of freedom, a story that originated in their move to be free of both Canaanites and Egyptians, and that legacy of freedom remains a lasting contribution to Western culture and as well as becoming a keystone of post-biblical Jewish identity. Thank you.